They said she'd never make it past the recruiter's desk. No sim hours. No family name. Just a dead father's crop duster and a farm girl's instinct. Then she flew a 20-year-old jet against the Navy's best F-35 pilot, and in 90 seconds, she broke him. Here's exactly how. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Dakota grew up on a grain and cattle operation outside a town so small it didn't have a stoplight, just a four-way stop and a feed store that doubled as the post office. Her grandfather, Walt Reyes, had flown crop dusters for 30 years before arthritis took his hands, and by the time Dakota was old enough to reach the rudder pedals, he'd already decided she was going to be the one who kept the family plane in the air. The plane was a 1974 air tractor, patched more times than anyone could count, painted a shade of orange that had faded to something closer to rust. Walt called her the old girl and treated every flight like a conversation between man and machine. He didn't believe in flying by instinct alone, and he didn't believe in flying by instruments alone either. He believed in something in between, a kind of physical literacy that most pilots never bothered to develop because modern aircraft didn't require it anymore. Instruments will tell you what already happened, he told her once, when she was 14 and terrified after a near miss with a grain elevator. Your body tells you what's about to happen. You learn to listen to both, you'll never be surprised by anything in the sky. By 16, Dakota was flying solo application runs over 3 counties, banking the air tractor into turns so tight the wingtip vortices kicked up dust from the fence rows. She learned to read wind shear off the way wheat bent in the field below her. She learned that an engine sputtering wasn't always a fuel problem, sometimes it was carb ice, sometimes it was a valve about to fail, and the difference showed up as a texture in the sound long before any gauge would flag it. She learned to fly a chandelle turn at 40 feet off the deck because that was the only way to reverse course fast enough to make a second pass before the spray drifted off target. None of this looked like fighter pilot training. It looked like a farm kid doing farm work. But everything Dakota was absorbing, energy management, the physical feel of an airplane approaching a stall, the ability to make split-second decisions with degraded information, was, in fact, exactly the kind of foundation that produces exceptional combat aviators. She just didn't know it yet. Her grandfather died the winter she turned 19, and the operation couldn't survive without him. The bank took the equipment within a year. Dakota watched the air tractor get loaded onto a flatbed truck and driven off to a buyer 3 states away, and she has said in interviews since that it felt like watching a family member get taken to a hospital she knew they wouldn't come home from. She enlisted 8 months later. The recruiter in Lincoln wanted to put her into aviation maintenance. She had a GED, a farm background, and no 4-year degree. On paper, she wasn't officer material, and without officer's wings, she'd never sit in the front seat of a Navy jet. Dakota didn't argue. She just asked what she'd need to change that on paper, wrote it all down, and spent the next several years doing exactly that, an associate's degree through night classes while working aircraft maintenance on an amphibious assault ship, then a transfer program that got her into a 4-year school, then officer candidate school at 24, older than nearly everyone else in her cohort. At flight school in Pensacola, she was the outlier in almost every sense. Most of her classmates had logged simulator hours before they could drive. Several had fathers or uncles who'd flown fighters. Dakota had logged more raw flight hours than half the class combined, but almost none of it was recognized as relevant experience by the syllabus. Agricultural flying isn't glamorous, and nobody expects it to translate to a supersonic strike fighter. It translated better than anyone expected. Her flight instructor, a hard-edged lieutenant commander named Priya Anand, ran her students through an unusual departure from controlled flight exercise in the T-6 Texan II, an intentional, unrecoverable feeling flat spin, meant to see who panicked and who defaulted to procedure. Most students froze for a beat before running the checklist by rote. Dakota didn't freeze, and she didn't run the checklist verbatim either. She felt the airframe's rotation rate, made a judgment call about which control input would break the spin fastest given the specific way the aircraft was behaving, and recovered in a fraction of the expected time. Anand asked her afterward where she'd learned to do that. Dakota told her about grain silos and dead engines over Nebraska wheat fields. Anand wrote a single line in her evaluation notes that would follow Dakota through the rest of her career: exceptional airmanship. Recommend fighter track. It wasn't only her flying that set her apart. Dakota was older than most of her classmates by half a decade, and it showed in small ways nobody in the syllabus graded her on. She didn't panic in the debrief room the way the 22-year-olds did when an instructor tore apart a flight in front of everyone. She'd already spent years being told by bank officers and insurance adjusters that her family's operation wasn't viable, that the numbers didn't work, that she should quit while she still had something left. A stern flight instructor with a red pen was, by comparison, easy to sit across from. Her classmates noticed the difference too, though not always kindly at first. She didn't talk about vacation homes or family boats. She didn't recognize half the references her peers made to each other's father's old squadrons. One classmate, a sharp-tongued lieutenant junior grade named Colt Whitfield, asked her early on, half as a joke, whether she'd learned to fly on a tractor. Dakota told him, without missing a beat, that a tractor was actually harder to keep straight in a crosswind than anything he'd flown so far, and the room laughed at him instead of her. By the end of primary training, Whitfield was the one asking her for study sessions before the emergency procedures exam. What made her dangerous in the cockpit, Anand would say later, wasn't raw talent alone. Plenty of her classmates had raw talent. It was that Dakota had already spent a decade solving problems where failure meant losing the family business, or worse, and that kind of pressure calibrates a person's nervous system in ways a checklist never can. When an engine coughed at low altitude over a Nebraska field with a loaded hopper of chemical overhead, there was no tower to call, no wingman to lean on, no simulator reset button. There was only the next 4 seconds and whatever she'd learned to do with them. Dakota earned her wings flying the F/A-18E Super Hornet, an aircraft the Navy had been quietly, slowly retiring from front-line strike duty in favor of the newer F-35C Lightning II. She picked up the call sign Magpie during her first deployment, not for any particular heroics, but because she had an odd habit of collecting small broken parts from the flight line and fixing them in her off hours, the way a magpie collects shiny objects. It stuck. 2 deployments and 1 combat qualification later, she was selected for the Navy's Elite Strike Fighter Tactics program at NAS Fallon, the schoolhouse known throughout naval aviation simply as Top Gun. NAS Fallon sits in a high desert basin in western Nevada, ringed by the Stillwater and Clan Alpine Mountains, a landscape so dry and empty that pilots sometimes joke you could crash land almost anywhere and not hit anything but sagebrush. The airspace above it, the Fallon Range Training Complex, is some of the most heavily instrumented combat training airspace in the world, wired with sensors that record every maneuver down to the degree. Only a small fraction of naval aviators are ever invited to attend. Dakota was one of 14 pilots in her class, and one of only 2 flying the older Super Hornet. The Navy had committed most of its newest talent, and nearly all of its newest hardware, to the F-35C. The instructor running the class was Commander Elaine Cruz, call sign Reaper, a veteran of 2 combat tours who had a reputation for dismantling pilots' egos in the first week so she could rebuild something more useful in the second. Cruz didn't care whose kid you were or what jet you'd been assigned. She cared about one thing, whether you could win a fight when your technology failed you, because sooner or later, against a capable adversary, it would. The whole premise of 5th-generation air power is that you never get close enough to dogfight, Cruz told the class on day 1. Stealth, sensor fusion, beyond visual range missiles, the doctrine says the merge should never happen. But doctrine is written by people hoping for the best case. I train you for the worst case. Because someday, some adversary is going to jam your radar, spoof your sensors, or simply get inside minimum missile range before you know they're there. And when that happens, the only computer that matters is the one between your ears. Among Dakota's classmates was Lieutenant Marcus Kingsley, call sign Halo, flying the F-35C. Kingsley came from a family with 3 generations of naval aviators behind him. His grandfather had flown Phantoms over Vietnam, his father had commanded a carrier air wing. Kingsley was talented, meticulous, and had never lost a training engagement. He flew with a kind of precision that looked almost inhuman, because in a sense it was. The F-35's flight control computer did much of the fine muscle work for him, blending control surfaces automatically to hold the jet at the exact edge of its performance envelope. Kingsley trusted that computer completely, and it had never once let him down. He also, from the first day, treated Dakota's presence in the program as something between a curiosity and an inconvenience. He wasn't cruel about it, exactly, he was worse, in a way, because he was polite. He asked her once, not unkindly, whether she'd requested the Super Hornet or simply hadn't been offered the F-35 pipeline. She told him the truth, she'd requested it, because she'd rather master a jet fully than half know one that flew itself. He laughed, assuming she was joking. The rest of the first week fell into a predictable rhythm. Mornings were spent in the academic wing, working through electronic warfare theory and sensor fusion doctrine with instructors who assumed most of the class had already absorbed the basics from years of simulator time. Dakota hadn't, and she made no secret of it, staying late most evenings with a stack of manuals and a legal pad covered in her own diagrams, translating radar cross-section theory into terms that made sense against the only frame of reference she had, how a hawk disappears into a tree line, how a crop duster can vanish against a wheat field if the light and dust are right. It was a strange way to learn combat electronics, but it worked, and by the second week she was answering questions in class that stumped pilots who'd flown nothing but fifth-generation jets their entire careers. Kingsley, for his part, treated the academic sessions the way he treated everything else in the program, as a formality he'd already mastered somewhere along the family lineage of naval aviators leading back to him. He wasn't wrong to be confident. His flying was genuinely excellent, disciplined down to the smallest control input, and his understanding of the F-35 systems ran deeper than almost anyone else's in the class, instructors included. What he lacked, though nobody in that briefing room would have said so out loud yet, was any real experience being wrong. He had never had an aircraft fail him at the worst possible moment. He had never had to solve a problem the manual didn't already have an answer for. The first phase of the syllabus was basic fighter maneuvers, close range, visual range dogfighting, guns only, no missiles. Cruz paired the students deliberately, and when she got to the bottom of the roster, she paired Kingsley against Reyes. "Let's see what a fifth-generation jet does against agricultural instincts," she said, and there was a ripple of laughter in the briefing room. Dakota didn't laugh, and she didn't flinch either. She'd been underestimated in briefing rooms before. On paper, the matchup wasn't close. The F-35C's high angle of attack handling meant Kingsley could point his aircraft's nose almost anywhere regardless of its actual flight path, a capability the Super Hornet simply didn't have in the same measure. His helmet-mounted display fed him a real-time, computer-generated picture of the fight, projecting predicted flight paths and firing solutions directly onto his visor. Dakota would be flying an older airframe with none of that, relying on raw eyesight, feel, and instinct against a machine explicitly engineered to make instinct less necessary. Every analyst in the building expected the engagement to be short. That afternoon, the Nevada heat shimmered off the tarmac as the two jets taxied out. Over the tactical frequency, Kingsley's voice was easy, almost bored. "Don't feel bad about this one, Magpie. Nobody beats the jet." "I'm not fighting the jet," Dakota answered. "I'm fighting you." They climbed to altitude, separated to a preset distance, and turned back toward each other. In the underground control bunker, Cruz stood with her arms folded, watching the telemetry feed alongside her tactical analyst, a soft-spoken lieutenant commander named Ray Okafor. "Kingsley's going to take her in the horizontal," Okafor said, watching the geometry develop. "The F-35 sustained turn rate against that old Rhino, it's not going to be close." "Watch the Rhino anyway," Cruz said quietly. At the merge, the two jets crossed canopy to canopy at a combined closure speed north of 900 knots, close enough that for a fraction of a second Dakota could see the gold tint of Kingsley's visor. Then the fight was on. Kingsley pulled immediately into a hard, high G turn, letting the F-35's flight control computer optimize the maneuver in real time, blending flaps, rudder, and stabilators to bleed the minimum possible energy while achieving maximum turn rate. His helmet display painted a projected intercept path, showing him almost exactly where Dakota's jet would be in the next several seconds. Dakota felt 7 Gs crush down on her chest as she hauled the Super Hornet into its own turn, tightening her stomach and forcing short bursts of breath to keep blood in her brain. Her vision narrowed at the edges. She didn't glance at her instruments. She could feel the airframe shuddering, feel the drag biting at the wing's leading edge, feel exactly how close to the edge of controlled flight she was, the same sensation, scaled up by a factor of 10, that she'd felt 100 times pulling a crop duster out of a low pass over a fence line. Tone. "I've got a lock," Kingsley called, voice cool, already sliding toward her 6 o'clock. "You're bleeding energy, Magpie. This one's already over." He wasn't wrong about the numbers. In a pure horizontal turning fight, the F-35 systems gave Kingsley too large an edge to overcome. Dakota knew that going in. So she didn't fight the fight he wanted. She rolled inverted and pulled the nose straight down, dragging the engagement into a vertical dive toward the mountains below, trying to force a mistake the computer couldn't correct for. Kingsley followed her down without hesitation, his jet systems automatically managing his throttle and pitch to hold optimal position, waiting for the moment she would have to pull out and present herself as an easy shot. "Altitude, Magpie," Cruz warned over the radio as the numbers ticked down. "Watch the deck." At 8,000 feet, with the hard deck fast approaching, Dakota did something no analyst in the bunker predicted. Instead of pulling up cleanly, she chopped her throttles to idle, deployed her speed brakes, and threw the jet into a violent, deliberate deceleration, intentionally destroying her own airspeed in less than 2 seconds. In modern air combat, speed is treated as a form of life support, deliberately discarding it is considered close to suicidal. Kingsley's F-35 closed the gap almost instantly, his system screaming a closure rate warning a half-second too late for pure reflex to override the trust he'd placed in them all these years. He shot past her canopy, overshooting completely. The model had assumed no rational pilot would intentionally stall an aircraft 3,000 feet above rising terrain. "Overshoot," Okafor said in the bunker, sitting forward so fast he nearly knocked over his coffee. He overshot her. Kingsley recovered fast, though, faster than most pilots could have. He hauled the F-35 into a high angle of attack pitch up, using the jet's raw thrust to hang the nose in the air and slow further, trying to swing back around onto her before she could build speed again. "Nice move, Magpie," he said, breathing hard now. "Still got the angle, though." Dakota was hanging at barely over 100 knots, her Super Hornet dangerously close to a full aerodynamic stall, the stick going soft and mushy in her hands as the jet's own flight computer fought her, trying to push the nose down and rebuild airspeed the safe way. She reached down and disengaged the alpha limiter, the software governor designed to prevent exactly the kind of extreme, uncommanded departure from controlled flight she was about to attempt. In the bunker, the telemetry display lit up red. "She's pulled her limiters," Okafor said, staring at the raw data feed like it had to be a glitch. "She's flying the jet completely unassisted at the edge of a stall." Cruz didn't answer right away. Disabling the alpha limiter on a Super Hornet at low altitude, low airspeed, and high angle of attack is exactly the kind of input the safety systems exist to prevent. It's briefed against in every syllabus, flagged in every safety stand-down. It is, by any conventional measure, an extraordinarily dangerous thing to do. Above the desert, Dakota wasn't thinking about any of that. She was thinking about a grain silo outside Norfolk, Nebraska, and the last half-second before you either commit to the turn or you don't. She kicked the rudder hard to the stop and slammed the stick diagonally forward, and without the computer softening her inputs, the heavy jet snapped around its own center of mass in a brutal, almost ugly pivot, a maneuver agricultural pilots call a hammerhead, used to reverse direction in dead air at the end of a field, never meant for anything moving anywhere near this fast. For a critical half-second, Kingsley's sensors couldn't make sense of what they were seeing. The F-35's tracking systems are extraordinarily good at predicting the flight path of an aircraft, because aircraft, as a rule, obey a fairly narrow set of physical patterns. What Dakota's jet was doing didn't fit any of them. It was falling and rotating and reversing direction all at once, outside the parameters the system had been trained to expect. The targeting cue on Kingsley's visor fractured, slid, and disappeared. "I've lost the track," Kingsley said, and for the first time all day, there was real alarm in his voice. Systems not reacquiring. He hadn't lost the track. He'd lost the fight. Dakota's nose came around and pointed straight down at the top of his aircraft, still hanging awkwardly in its high alpha stance, bleeding speed, wide open. She slammed the throttles forward, felt the twin engines bite back into the thin desert air and arrest her fall, and rode the ragged edge of a stall straight down onto his position. She didn't need a radar lock. She didn't need a computer-generated firing solution. She had eyes on the target and a lifetime of instinct telling her exactly when to pull the trigger. "Guns, guns, guns," she said, her voice flat and steady over the radio. "Kill on the lightning. Good fight, Halo." Nobody spoke for a long moment. In the bunker, Okafor slowly sat back in his chair. Cruz allowed herself something close to a smile. "Well," she said. "I'll be damned." 40 minutes later, the two jets taxied back in under a blistering Nevada sun. Ground crew who'd been following the live telemetry feed stood along the flight line in near silence as the canopies popped open. Kingsley was down the ladder first, helmet already off, face flushed with something between disbelief and anger. He crossed the tarmac toward Dakota as she climbed down from her own jet. "You pulled your limiters," he said. "That's a flight safety violation. My systems couldn't track a flight path that isn't physically rational. You didn't outfly me, you broke the rules." Dakota unclipped her oxygen mask and let it hang against her flight suit. She wasn't angry, and she didn't raise her voice. "If that had been a real adversary over open water," she said, "they wouldn't care what your software could or couldn't predict. You flew the computer, Marcus. I flew the airplane." Before Kingsley could respond, Cruz walked out onto the tarmac, and she didn't stop at Dakota, she went straight to Kingsley. "Save it for the debrief," Cruz told him. "She didn't cheat. She broke your rhythm. You've spent your whole career trusting a helmet to tell you what's happening outside your own canopy, and today it cost you. We are training pilots to fight adversaries who will jam our radars and spoof our sensors. When the screens go dark, I need aviators who still know how to fly." Then she turned to Dakota, studying her for a long moment before speaking. "Lieutenant Reyes," she said. "That maneuver was reckless and, from a pure survivability standpoint, borderline foolish. It was also the single best piece of raw instinctual flying I've seen from a student in this program. Get cleaned up. You're teaching the low-speed energy seminar this afternoon." Dakota straightened and answered the way she'd been trained. "Yes, ma'am." Word of the engagement moved through the Fallon schoolhouse within the day, and within the week it had reached squadrons well beyond it, not because a Super Hornet beat an F-35C in a single training engagement, which happens more often in syllabus fights than the public imagines, but because of how it happened. The Navy's own internal analysis, conducted afterward, didn't frame the result as evidence the F-35 was somehow inferior. It framed it as something more specific and more useful, a reminder that any system built to predict human behavior has blind spots exactly where human behavior stops being predictable. Commander Cruz used the footage in her seminars for years afterward, not to make a point about old jets beating new ones, but to make a point about the pilots flying them. Technology, she told her classes, gives you an edge, sometimes a decisive one. But it is trained on patterns, and patterns can be broken by anyone willing to fly outside them. The pilots who survive a fair fight against a technologically superior adversary are rarely the ones who outcomputed their opponent. They are the ones who stopped relying on the computer at the exact moment it mattered most. Dakota Reyes finished the program at the top of her class and was retained at Fallon as an instructor the following year, teaching a course she helped design herself, Analog Combat Maneuvering, built specifically around the kinds of energy management techniques that modern flight computers are designed to prevent pilots from ever needing. Marcus Kingsley, to his credit, requested to sit in on one of her first classes. They don't tell people it was contentious. They say it was useful. Years later, when she was asked in an interview what she'd tell a young pilot who felt like they didn't belong in a room full of people with better resumes and better connections, Dakota didn't talk about the F-35 engagement at all. She talked about a rusted orange crop duster and a grandfather who used to say that instruments will tell you what already happened, but your body will tell you what's about to happen, and that the pilots who forget how to listen to their own bodies are the ones who get surprised by the sky. The engagement itself was never publicized in any official capacity. Training footage from Fallon almost never is, but versions of the story spread anyway, the way stories do inside a community as small and tightly wound as naval aviation. Junior pilots retold it in ready rooms on carriers half a world away, usually with a few details exaggerated and a few others quietly dropped, the way any good flight line legend accumulates its own mythology over time. By the time Dakota heard her own story repeated back to her by a nugget pilot who had no idea he was talking to the actual person involved, half of it was unrecognizable. She let him finish before telling him who she was. He didn't believe her at first. What never changed in any retelling, though, was the core of it, a pilot flying an older jet, stripped of every technological advantage her opponent possessed, had won by refusing to let the fight be decided by anything other than her own hands on the stick. Crews built an entire 2-week block of the Fallon syllabus around that idea in the years that followed, using anonymized telemetry from the engagement, sanitized of names, exact dates, and hull numbers, the way all training material eventually is, to teach incoming classes that a numerical advantage in avionics is not the same thing as a guaranteed victory in a fight. Pilots learn what the machine can do. Fewer of them ever learn what they can do without it, and crews made it her mission to close that gap before the next real war made the lesson far more expensive than a training sortie over the Nevada desert. Kingsley eventually made his peace with the outcome, in his own way. He never fully agreed that the engagement had been a fair test of the F-35's capabilities. He maintained, correctly by most technical measures, that in 99 out of 100 repeats of that exact scenario, the jet's advantages would carry the day. But he stopped bringing up the alpha limiter violation as though it settled the argument in his favor, and he started asking Dakota questions instead, real questions, about energy states and low-speed handling and the strange intuitive math of a maneuver that had no clean equation behind it. 2 years later, flying his second combat deployment, he radioed a young wingman who'd frozen up during a chaotic low-altitude engagement and told him, almost word for word, something Dakota had said to a class of her own: fly the airplane, not the display. He never mentioned where he'd first heard it. Dakota Reyes eventually left active instructing to fly with a reserve squadron closer to home, close enough that on weekends she can drive out past the old county line and see what used to be her grandfather's fields, now owned by a neighboring operation that grows soybeans where the wheat used to stand. She doesn't fly crop dusters anymore. She doesn't need to. But when new students at Fallon ask her how she keeps her hands steady during a maneuver most pilots are trained from day one to avoid entirely, she tells them the truth, the same answer every time, delivered in the same flat, unhurried Nebraska cadence that once made a fifth-generation stealth fighter completely lose track of what it was looking at. She still keeps a small dented piece of aluminum on her desk, salvaged from that old air tractor before it was sold off the farm. It isn't much to look at. But everyone who's flown with her knows exactly what it means. On the anniversary of her grandfather's death, she still drives out to the old fence line where the crop duster used to make its final pass before turning home for the day. She doesn't stay long, usually just long enough to watch the wind move through whatever's growing there that season, reading the field the same way Walt taught her to read it 50 years before any radar screen or heads-up display ever tried to do the same job for someone else. Some lessons, she says, were never meant to be replaced. Only carried forward.